As anti-racism protests continue across the United States and in Canada and around the world, they are sparking a conversation about racism here in Canada. And while the protests have been going on, Ottawa has announced it's delaying its national action plan to tackle systemic racism facing Indigenous peoples. The top recommendations from that inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So joining us now to share her thoughts is Sheila North. She's a former MKO Grand Chief and a regular contributor here on Your Morning. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Anne-Marie.
In Canada, we remember the names of Tina Fontaine and of Colton Boushie. So when you hear some of our political leaders over the past week, all of whom are white, saying there is no systemic racism in Canada or that our experience here is different than in the United States, what's your reaction?
I say go meet the mothers and the sisters and family members of the ones that have been taken. It's a very, very sensitive and touchy subject. And for people to be blatant and to be so dismissive like that is just reminiscent of what they've been dealing with for many generations. And it's very hurtful to hear, and it's very concerning to know that this kind of thinking still persists in Canada.
You have to wonder, Sheila, what it will take. We've had the UN put out a paper saying there is systemic racism towards Indigenous peoples in this country. We have seen a national inquiry find the same results, yet there's still politicians and leaders who are saying it does not exist here. Some further evidence, Indigenous people account for almost a quarter of Canada's federal prison population, despite the fact that they make up just over 4% of the Canadian population. They suffer highest rates of police-involved deaths. There were major parallels between the experience of Black Americans and Canadian Indigenous peoples in their interactions with police. In your opinion, what needs to change?
Those are very, very disheartening stats. And yes, we live with those every day, along with what's happening with the pandemic. And we're seeing that number and that concern also in the pandemic, because we keep reminding people that Indigenous people are the most vulnerable. And what are we going to do about it? Well, I think we're seeing it all played out in the States, and I think it's being magnified. And the biggest difference, I think, and I'm not going to take away what happened, especially because it's happening to Black people in America, but it happens every day also to Black people and Indigenous people and people of color in Canada. The only thing that the biggest difference is it was caught on camera. But these kind of incidents that are racially motivated happen almost every day. In Winnipeg, there was three young people, Indigenous people, that died at the hands of police. We don't know the results of the investigations of that yet, or the findings, but it does seem to appear, just by optics, that there's still this tension between police and Indigenous people in Canada. And not only that, it's all forms, like I say, in the healthcare system. So we have to look at finding a way to change policing policies, the policing culture, and even the government policy. Right now is a perfect time to start changing these kind of policies and regulations, because politicians need support from the public to make big changes, and right now they have it in a big way.
An important point to make. Sheila, you've had your own experiences being on the receiving end of racism. Could you tell us about some of those experiences?
Well, when I was first here in Winnipeg as a teenager, being called dirty Indian and things like that, all the way up to being a young mom with my little kids and they're on their little tricycles, and somebody came running out saying that we were on their lawn and we weren't, but he was just looking for an excuse and calling my kids dirty Indians, all the way up to a couple of years ago when I was in a grocery or a pharmacy looking for things and I was accused of shoplifting. And you feel it like a gut punch, and you feel horrible. You think that you've done something wrong at first. But now I realize that this is a problem that persists. And when it happens to good people like my mother, then it is a real problem. And that's when I spoke out last time. And racism, it's hard to deal with, but it's harder to live with. And it does lead to death. And we have to find ways to do it. Our young people are the biggest hope. I think they have the possibility of changing the narrative going forward. But this has been persistent for generations, and we all grow up in the same way, disregarding Indigenous people, disrespecting, all the way from grade school to law schools, and now we're seeing this being played out in all forms of, industries and businesses. So it's not a surprise. It is a systemic problem.
You mentioned talking about solutions and policy and the National Action Plan to tackle systemic racism towards Indigenous communities. was supposed to be implemented yesterday. It is being delayed due to COVID-19. So what was your reaction when you heard that the results of the inquiry, 2 years, $92 million, the results and the recommendations on that were supposed to be delivered have now been delayed?
Well, thankfully, I'm always just cautiously optimistic. I always, wait and see what happens. And thankfully, I haven't, because I'm not totally disappointed, because I'm not surprised. But I know that many families are disappointed and they're let down and they're crying, and because they're being reminded again that there is failure, and lack of action shows that lack of empathy and caring. And, the government, no matter what they do going forward, they're going to not look good in the end, because because of all these false starts and also seemingly lack of caring. And I know that there's lots of good people in the government, but at the same time, there are lots of hurting people on the ground that need answers and justice. And I believe the only way that could be done is if they turn it over to an independent body to do the work, the implementation, to strike up an investigative body to look at old cases in some way. And that's a huge task and a tall order. But I think that's where it needs to go, because no matter what the government does or plans in the end, it'll never be enough, because it's their plan. And so I think they have to take it outside. And I know that, the one of the reasons that the government says there's been a delay is the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I could see that for sure. But at the same time, maybe this is good, so we can all keep pausing and see what the best look forward is. And I don't believe it rests solely on the government.
Sheila, I want to thank you for your time today and for being on Your Morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for watching. If you like this, be sure to subscribe here.
And you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.